Okay, hello everyone. I want to just give you a little bit of feedback on the essays that you've done for me this week. Uh, I've hoped, well, most people have sent them. Some people haven't sent them, but probably if you're the people who haven't sent them, you're people who are not watching. So that's not, I'm going to write to people individually. So, okay, I've got a few things that I want to say. Obviously, you've all had individual feedback on your work. Some people I wrote more than others. If you need more explanation, just let me know. Okay, so overall, the standard of writing is okay. It's not so bad. Obviously, there's a big range. Some people are better than others. That's to be expected. There are a few things which apply to a lot of people that I want to discuss. Just a couple of general comments first. Some people have been asked to do the task again. If you've been asked to do it again, you shouldn't look upon that as some kind of punishment for doing for doing weak work. The point is that if you are not at a very high standard at the moment, then you need to improve. And the only way you're going to improve is through practicing. So it isn't even necessarily the case that I think that your work is very bad and has to be done again because it's not acceptable. In some cases it was more that I felt that you could do better, and I felt that practicing again would be beneficial for you. The whole idea of this class is that you write, that I read it, and that I try to help you write again better. It's not a question of just trying to complete a certain number of pieces of work and moving on, right? The point is to improve your writing skill. So actually, a lot of people would do well to write again. There are several people where I suggested that if you want to, you may write again and resubmit. That's true for everybody. I mean, the people who got better marks, I didn't say that so much, but anybody who wants to can try to improve their grade. Obviously, don't just send me back the same essay with the changes that I made and then expect that you're going to get a higher mark for it because now there are no mistakes in it. If you want to get a better mark, you're going to have to rewrite the whole thing, taking into account all of my comments. But I would like you to study very carefully the comments that I made, what I said that you did wrong. You might not agree with everything, but well, such is life. You have to accept it. But you can always question. You can always ask me why. Um, that's fine. If you want to, as I said, you are free to try to improve. Okay. And if you have been told that you have to try to improve, again, you shouldn't look at that as a negative thing. Probably you know already that your writing isn't perfect. I know that some teachers will sort of let a lot of things go and will just give a 3 if they think that the work is not really very good. But I have to be careful. I don't want to be too negative with you, but at the same time, some of you need to get the signal that your writing isn't good enough. And what do I mean by good enough? What I mean by good enough is that, as I said, when we did manage to meet, the whole point of this course is to train you basically for next year, where you will have to write your thesis. Okay, and if your writing is not good, what will happen is you will write a few pages of your thesis, you will submit it, and your supervisor will just give it back to you and say, no, that this is not good enough. And then you'll be thinking, well, how is it possible that I did writing for a couple of years, I passed everything and there were no problems, and now suddenly I can't write and I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so we want to avoid that situation. At the very least, I want you to understand where the weaknesses are in your writing, so that when you do come to write something like that, you will know what you must be concentrating on. You will know what you should be looking out for. I don't want you going into the third year and into writing your thesis thinking that everything is fine when it's not. Okay. So I don't want to be too negative with people, especially at this time. I know some of you are maybe struggling with the whole situation that we have at the moment. It's very difficult. I know people in different situations, different environments. Some of you don't have ideal environments for working, and it's problematic. At the same time, there's no point doing the classes if I'm just going to say everything is okay. All right. So what we're looking to do is to improve, and that might mean having to do things again. And if it does, well, then we do them again, right? I mean, that's what we're here for. We're here to write. Okay. So a few general points. There were several things which I mentioned in the one class that we did have together, which I mentioned as things which are common problems, and they are common problems, and they occurred again, even though I mentioned them. I don't expect that one class would be enough to get rid of all these problems. So I'll just go through some of them. So of course, some of these things apply to many of you. Some of these things only apply to a few people, but it's always worth listening to the mistakes that other people made. And you're lucky this year in that you don't get me reading out individual works in class. I'm not going to do that when I give things back to people. So you got your individual comments in private, and now I'll just make some general comments, and nobody will know about whom I'm speaking. Okay. So there were a number of people whose work was marked where I wrote that you'd made some strange vocabulary choices and that you were trying too hard. Okay, so I talked about in the lesson that we had, and I talk about this in the presentation. I said that, you know, the best vocabulary to use is the right vocabulary, not the most fancy, clever, unusual vocabulary. So there were several people who obviously tried very hard to improve their writing by using less known words, by using maybe by using synonyms for words that they already knew to try to make some more variety and so on. And sometimes that's okay. I mean, I don't want to kind of stop you doing that completely, but at the same time, you have to only use words when you really know how to use them and really know what they mean. And there were quite a few cases of people using words which were just inappropriate, just the wrong words. Okay, either the wrong word that just didn't fit at all, or the words which were stylistically wrong. There were a few cases of this, especially when there were several of these words put together so that we had an elaborate sentence which didn't really fit. Okay, so please look at those and don't feel like I'm kind of trying to squash your ambitions to be more sophisticated in your vocabulary use, but you need to be very careful to make sure that you understand the words that you're using. Okay, so look at the comments that I made about that. The same is true about general structure of sentences. Again, I talked about this, right, that long, complicated sentences are great if you can handle them. In order to handle long, complicated sentences, you need to be good at punctuation. And it's a shame that we weren't able to do that together, to go through the punctuation, because and I asked you to look at the punctuation part of the presentation, but I can see that a lot of people are struggling with punctuation, right? So again, if you have corrections of punctuation in your paper, please don't look at it and say, it was only a comma, so that's okay, it's nothing. Some of those missing commas are very important. In many places, I've turned commas or full stops into colons and semicolons. And these things are important, right? The difference between a colon, a semicolon, and a comma, it's important. And you need to look very carefully at why it's being changed and not think that it's nothing important. Because basically what it comes down to is that if you can't use punctuation properly, then you can't use longer sentences, okay? Because a long sentence requires control. It requires control of punctuation, not to lose the reader, okay? The reader is only able to remember a certain amount of information. So it needs to be broken up so that the reader knows how to deal with certain bits before moving on to the next bit. So when you have a colon, we know that one section has finished, even though it's not the end of the sentence, but one section has finished, and then we start another. When we have a comma, very often commas don't mark out such differences. Okay. One simple way of thinking about those four pieces of punctuation is to think of them as pauses. Okay. The original reason for punctuation marks is to mark pauses in spoken texts. Okay. So you can look at it as like a comma is like a 1-beat pause, and a semicolon is a 2-beat pause, and a colon is a 3-beat pause, and a full stop is a 4-beat pause. Beats, like if you know something about music, right? So just 1, 1, 2. That's not always the case, because there are some technical, times when we use a comma when there isn't exactly a pause, and then sometimes we use the colon to introduce lists and things. But generally speaking, the degree of break is right in this 1, 2, 3, 4 system. So please have a look at the way that I've done it. So as I said, a number of people have tried to produce very complicated sentence structures and not really kept control of them very well. So if I've written at the end, if I put in one of the comments that this doesn't make any sense, it's often because the structure of the sentence, you've tried a little bit too hard to make something kind of complicated, and it hasn't really worked. Okay. On the other hand, the things connected with structure of individual sentences that I need to talk to you individually. So I've given the feedback on your papers, but every problem is different. Yeah. There's also a problem with structure of paragraphs. That again, I said to you, one paragraph. This is one idea. Several of you had paragraphs, particularly the first paragraph, where there were just a series of sentences with really no links between them, right? So you can't write paragraphs like that, right? If you're if you have one idea, you need to fully express it, and that's one paragraph. You can't make a paragraph out of separate, non-connected sentences. A lot of people also didn't really connect their paragraphs, right? So you don't always need to use a connecting word when you begin a paragraph, but there needs to be some, it needs to be obvious that there is some connection between what was said in one paragraph and what was said in the next paragraph, right? So you don't have to say the next thing is something like that, but it needs to look like that one thing follows from another. And some of you simply seem to have paragraphs which were just swimming on their own, without any connection to anything else. Okay, so we need to think about paragraphing, especially if you're going to write something longer. This becomes more and more of an issue, right? If you only have to write one paragraph, it's a little different. The more paragraphs you have to write, the more complicated that becomes. What I'm particularly concerned about, however, was the first paragraph, the introduction. So I can see from basically from the whole group, right, that you have not been taught how to write introductions, probably never how to write introductions to essays. Those of you who wrote reasonably good introductions, generally you wrote introductions which were acceptable, which were okay, but they weren't really what I wanted. Okay, nobody really wrote, maybe there were one or two, but generally nobody wrote a proper essay introduction. Okay, and so I'll just say a little bit about that. The key thing, the most important thing about an introduction is that it should introduce, right? So then the question is, what does it introduce? And a lot of you have the idea that your opening paragraph ought to introduce the topic you're going to talk about, which is to some extent true, but really what your introduction should be introducing is your essay. Okay, so you need to be making it clear in the introduction what is going to happen in your essay, what your essay is going to do, what your essay is about. So general comments, like general comments on the role of money in society, which we had, general comments on what language is when we're talking about dead languages, okay? These kinds of comments were not really what we need in the introduction. What we need in the introduction is for you to say, you're going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about this, and finally I'm going to say this. Now, you don't have to do it in the way that in this essay, I shall do this, I shall do that. If you can introduce it in a more interesting way. But what we need from the introduction is to understand what is going to come next. Because in most of your essays, you had an introduction which just mentioned the topic, and I had no idea what the next paragraph would be, or the next paragraph, or what general approach your essay was going to take. Okay, so this is clearly something that we need to work on. And the next writing task that you do, assess writing task, I think will be just to write an introduction, or possibly more than one introduction, to some essay titles, so I'll give you essay titles and you'll give an introduction to the essay, but you won't have to actually write the essay, but only write the introduction. Okay. In order to improve the writing of your own introductions, you need to read introductions. Now, the topic that I wanted to do next, I wanted to start talking about abstracts. Abstracts are a form of academic writing. Okay, an abstract, in academic life, it has a couple of different roles. So the abstract is something which comes at the beginning of every academic article. Any article that you look up, you will see that there is an abstract first. So what it does is it to some extent advertises the article. It also, to some extent, summarizes the article. And what's very important is that it puts the article in some kind of context academically, okay, so that people know what sort of framework it's in. It's not the same as an introduction, okay, because the abstracts generally will give, as I said, a kind of summary. It will also mention what the key results are, whereas you don't have to do that in an introduction. In an introduction, you can say that there will be some results, but you don't have to say what they are. So there are differences. The abstract is a much more, it's like a summary of the whole thing rather than an introduction to the paper. Okay, but in the academic world, abstracts have two different roles. As I said, that they count as a little sort of summary, a little advert for the paper at the beginning of the paper. So when one goes to a journal, one sees a paper, and the first thing one does is read the abstract. And very often we only read the abstracts and we don't go any further, or we can read the abstracts and skip straight to the conclusions, or something like that. But we also use abstracts to apply for conferences and so on. So if you want to appear at a conference, you send your abstract. So it's like an advert in that way. For this is my work, and asking people what they think about it. So then it gets judged and it gets accepted, and either you go or you don't. So what I'm going to do in the next few days, I'm going to post some abstracts that I want you to look at, and I'm probably going to ask you to do just a little non-assessed writing task in terms of analyzing them and comparing them. Okay, so that will be kind of your task for this week. And then I'll give you a task to write some introductions, which will be a task for the following week. And then I'm going to ask you, I think, over Easter. I mean, it's kind of silly to talk about Easter holiday, right? Because it's crazy timetable. But anyway, over Easter, I'm going to ask you to think about the topic that you want to have for your longer project, okay? So that after Easter, we can start talking about writing those projects, about how you're going to do it. I'll talk to you about using sources and using references, okay? A couple of people included references in their essays, but we need to talk more about how it's supposed to be done. And I'll give you much more guidance about what exactly I expect from that task, okay? But I want you to, so we're going to do a couple of things over the next couple of weeks, and then over Easter I want you to actually come up with your titles, and then you'll need to send your titles to me and get them approved. I would, as I said before, I would prefer you to do something which is kind of academic. I think is much better practice, much better training. The original idea was that you should have a free choice to do anything that you want, but I don't think that, writing about your hobby, I don't think is particularly good practice, particularly good training for writing your thesis next year. So I think it's better if you do something that's at least somehow connected with academic life. It doesn't have to be anything that you're thinking of doing for your thesis next year, but something where you will be able to find academic papers on that topic, and where you will kind of have to write in a fairly academic style. While I'm mentioning academic style, this one just reminds me of one more thing as sort of feedback to your essays. I didn't give any clear instructions about what kind of tone, what kind of style I wanted, and clearly it didn't have to be, it was a short essay, it didn't have to come across like it was some kind of academic paper. However, several people wrote in a far too personal way. Now, I want to be just be careful to explain what I mean here, that it's okay to use the pronoun I, right? There are some people who say you shouldn't use the pronoun I in academic papers. Those people are wrong. It's silly. And sometimes people go to, and this is a problem in Polish writing, sometimes people go to great lengths not to use I, and so they say things like the author of this paper, which is just stupid, right? So you can just say I. And I want your opinions. And I asked you, I said, I want you to think about things, and I want to know what you think. I want you to be creative. But some of them were, the perspective that was taken was too personal. It read too much like even a diary entry or like a comment sent to a friend. Some of you didn't really think broadly enough about the topics from a broader perspective, and then give your opinion from this broader perspective. Some of them were simply too narrow, too personal. Starting off, like with my experience is this, right? Which is not the way to start, right? So we need the introduction to the topic, to the essay, what's going to be in the essay, and you can have a paragraph giving your own opinion, giving your own experience, even if it's relevant. That's okay, but the whole essay itself has to be done from a more general point of view. You've got to have something that the audience, your readers, can relate to, can understand, and it can't be so closely linked to your own life. Okay, so I wasn't very strict about sort of academic style. That wasn't the point, but some of them were too personal, were not even academic in the sense of just kind of school university style. I don't mean research paper style. I just mean the kind of style that you would expect in an essay, knowing that you're going to give it to your teacher. There were one or two which I thought, would you give a school teacher something like that? With a little bit odd. So we need to be careful with that. That, of course, academic style is something that you can only develop. I can't teach you everything. I can give you some hints, but you can only develop it through reading. Okay. And if you want to know what I think is good academic style, then the best thing you can do is read my papers, right? They're all links there on my website. As it happens, I think that I'm quite a good academic stylist. Some people might disagree, but certainly I as you'll know from what I've said to you, I go for a fairly straightforward style. I don't like to use complicated words when I don't need to. Right? So if you're writing about a complicated topic, sometimes you'll need to use the vocabulary that goes with that topic, but if possible, you should stick to simpler words. Straightforward sentence construction unless it's necessary to do something more. Okay. But generally, read whatever you're interested in, but read academic papers, because you can't develop an academic style if you don't read academic papers, right? It's not going to just appear out of nowhere. And you have to be careful that sometimes people will talk about formal style, but there are very different, I don't like this phrase formal, but even then there are very different formal styles. You can have a very elaborate formal sort of almost literary style, which is not appropriate for academic writing. You can have an elaborate sort of formal style of address that you might use in a speech at a wedding or a funeral or something like that, which again is not appropriate for academic writing. So the idea that it's formal is not right. There is an academic style which you will learn by reading academic papers. So read academic papers. Okay. So what are we doing? I hope that you've all looked at the exercises that I gave you on punctuation. A lot of people had trouble with that. And on articles, almost everybody had at least one article wrong. Please look carefully at all the articles that I've changed and see where you went wrong, why I've changed it, okay? So have a look at those two. I will post this week some abstracts that I want you to look at, and I will ask you to do a little task comparing, okay? And then I'll follow that up with a task asking you to write introductions, okay, to some essay titles, but I won't ask you to write the whole essay, all right? So I want you to practice writing those introductions, and then it'll be easier for me when you've written an introduction. It'll be easier for me to say what's wrong with it, because I know that people, it's normal. Right? Every writer finds the first sentence is hard, right? So again, have a look at other at academic papers and how they begin, how the first paragraph, an introduction isn't just one paragraph, right? So if I ask you to write 500 words, obviously the introduction will only be one paragraph. But if you're going to write a thesis of 30 pages, right? So the introduction is going to be 2 pages, right? So it isn't like only the first paragraph, but look at the way that academic papers begin and try to learn from that, okay? As ever, please do write to me if you have any questions. You can get in touch with me via Skype. I'm here for you. Any problems that you have, any difficulties, don't be afraid to get in touch. Okay, I think that's everything for the moment. If there is any topic which you would like me to cover, actually to talk about, okay, anything that's from the presentation, if you want me to talk more about punctuation, if you want me to talk more about paragraphing or something, just let me know and I'll make a video talking about it. When I can't see you and I don't see your faces and I don't know whether you're looking like completely bewildered or you're nodding with understanding, it's very difficult for me to know what I should, whether I should repeat something, whether I should bring in another topic. So you have to help me, okay? This is also difficult for me. Okay, right. So we'll be in touch and keep checking the page for new developments and new tasks to do. Okay. Okay. Thank you.